So we're gonna get started. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you as we reach the end of our spring series of lectures of the Rocky Mountain Map Society. It has been a great semester. I go by semester since I teach. Sorry about that. Because we have had all sorts of talks, not only here, but also we have been sharing talks with other map societies. So it's been a wonderful time for the society as we actually open up again in person. So it was a great relief. At this point, I would like to just pause and thank all of the members of the board of directors of the Rocky Mountain Map Society that during the whole year have been giving us so much input. They've been keeping the finances straight, the website up and running, and all of these programs, with very high quality. In in particular, I would like to bring attention to our program director. She may be surprised that I'm doing this because Naomi Heiser has been keeping a very high quality number of programs throughout the whole year, from anywhere from the age of cartography to the space age to even an interactive session like we're going to have today. Believe it or not, you're going to have to participate and make a good and an ugly map, but we'll hear about that. But I would like to thank Naomi for all that she has been doing for the society on these past several years. And so let's give her a big round of applause because she deserves it. But Naomi, it's not time for you to relax and just sit down. You got to come up here and tell us what's up on the horizon in terms of programs, and also introduce our speaker for tonight. So if you can, this is your last, I promise this is your last job for the spring. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. You picking up in the Zoom world here, Kevin? Okay, there we go. Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. This is our final program for the season. We want to thank all of our members and people in the audience who could yet be members for your continuous participation and patience as we've navigated this hybrid format. And thank you also to History Colorado folks like Kevin Smith here who have been helpful for our whole season with the hybrid format. Anyone who hasn't become a member yet, you are certainly welcome to, and you can do that through our website or by sending a check to our treasurer, Wesley Brown. This fall, after the summer break, we'll return to Map Month programming, which we haven't had for a couple of years. So instead of the May Map Month, we'll have one in September. And there will be a series of weekly talks on historical Denver mapping this September. And then rounding out the fall programs will be talks on historical mapping of the West and perhaps maps on stamps, right? Yeah, we have a member here who would do that. All right, moving on. Our speaker tonight is Sarah Kelly. Sarah M. Kelly is a teaching assistant professor of geography at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she's been for 5 of her 10 years of teaching. She's also done environmental modeling work for the public and private sectors. She has an MA in geography from the University of South Florida. This presentation will be a little bit different than our usual focus on how specific map topics are mapped. Instead, Sarah will present tools and theory to better understand how cartography works. She invites questions and comments from the audience on how you see the maps that she's going to present. When Sarah brings her cartography classes to the map library at CU where I work, we always learn a lot from her and her students about how to evaluate maps based on aesthetic choices, display of data, and ease of reading. This knowledge is going to be useful for you all, both when presented with maps of current events from our media, for example, or in analyzing historical maps for narratives that they present. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Kelly.
Thank you very much, Naomi. We good here? Hear me all right? Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me, everybody. We're going to kind of go through some kind of basics. I think Naomi probably described it better than I would of kind of things that I teach my students, how we create and then assess maps. And then we'll have some examples in the middle that I will welcome comments on, but then we have a series at the end. We'll definitely go through and see that they aren't necessarily all bad or ugly. There's definitely some good ones in there, but some very interesting ones as well. So often it's not about necessarily, if they're doing things right per se, but how they are presenting that information and how it's received by the reader, which is you. Oh, closer. Oh boy. Okay. Giving it kisses. Okay. Okay. All right. If you could go to the first slide. Okay. So Naomi already gave a background for me, so I guess we can kind of skip over this one. Maybe go to the next one. All right. So what I hope you gain by the end of my presentation. So understand how a map is defined. Think about the techniques the cartographer might have used for that map. Critically assess the maps based on those techniques. So how are you kind of seeing this based on the things that I'm teaching my students? And then understand a variety of cartographic methods and appreciate the differences of those methods. But first, let's go back in time a little bit. All right, so Ptolemy's map, hopefully you have seen this one before, used from about 150 AD to 1600 AD. And Ptolemy was a Greek geographer, and he was looking to describe the world. So he organized the map here of the world, at least the world known at the time, and used the graticule, lines of latitude and longitude, and also tried to describe climate patterns. It was north-oriented, Mediterranean focused, but very, very incomplete. Africa is labeled right there, and you can see it's just a portion of the continent. It's not even known or described as being circumnavigable. So very limited, but for the time, a lot of information being presented here in a very beautiful and interesting map. You can see the faces of kind of climate around the map, very decorative, but also very informative. Here's a world map from 1154. This was a gentleman who traveled to Sicily to produce an Arabic language geography guide. So small circular map here. Again, nothing we can necessarily maybe recognize today. Maybe Ptolemy's map was a little more recognizable of what we think of as a map today. But unlike East-oriented Christian maps of the time, this puts south at the top in the tradition of Muslim map makers. However, on this map, we do see Africa there kind of in the lower left as circumnavigable. So they added some information there, but we also lost a lot of the information that we saw on Ptolemy's map that we could kind of relate to today. Map Amundi from 1300, very Christian based. It was the world during medieval times, again, not necessarily recognizable of how we have it today. It was East oriented. Christ is actually hovering over the top. If you can click again, I think an animation will come through of what it looks like, kind of restored. You can see it a little better there. And Christ is up there at the top. And it shows the Garden of Eden, the Straits of Gibraltar, and Jerusalem at the center of the map. So very, very religious-based map, and 1300 time period. One of the few maps that we have from East Asia in 1402. This was designed by a team of royal astronomers in Korea. The labeling that's on there, I put on there so you had a reference. That was not part of the original map, but just to give some context. You see Africa very small, China in the center very large, Korea off to the side. It is north-oriented, but this was not politically, or it was focused on political, not religious based. And this was because the ideology at the time was that you should be looking towards the emperor in the north, and the emperor at the north is looking down on his people. So that was the reason it was north facing. Oh, Japan is kind of offset there. Got that over there. Okay, next one, please. Waldseemüller's map of 1507. This was the first map to utilize America. It was South America at the time, but the term America, this was the first time we see it documented in maps. It's very similar to Ptolemy's map, kind of similar shape, has latitude and longitude, trying to depict as much of the known map areas at the time. You can see part of South America there at the lower left, just little bits of North America starting to show up. You do see the whole of Africa. And the map actually consists of 12 pieces. So if you see kind of the rectangles indicated on there, those are actually woodcuts, each measuring 18 by 24.5 inches. So this is not one solid map. It is sections that were pieced together. But again, very, very decorative. If you look around the outside, some of the cartouches and things used, very beautiful map from 1507. Mercator's map, everyone's favorite. At least I kind of try to joke about this one anyway. We first see it come about in 1569. And the big thing with this one, and why sometimes we still see it today, if you use Google Maps, you have seen this projection. You have seen this type of map, is because of navigation. The time, we didn't have GPS, we didn't have phones to tell us how to get from one place to another. We had to use a compass. Well, in using a compass, think about if we have to constantly adjust that compass bearing, that makes it much more difficult to travel. With Mercator's map, you could set a compass bearing, even if it wasn't the shortest distance between 2 points, but you could set that compass bearing, keep it that way to get to your location. So very important for sea travel and even land travel at that time. So you didn't have to rely on kind of that constant adjustment. So something we still see today, and that's why you also see it on Google Maps. As you zoom into Google Maps, a right angle as represented on the ground, as you would see it physically standing there, you see the same thing on Google Maps or Google Earth. The Atlas Major in 1662, this is a world map. It actually it's a true atlas with 594 maps. This is kind of the main atlas at the beginning. Around 3,000 pages of text. So this was not just map-based. There was a lot of information in this atlas. It does place Earth at the center of the universe. And this is one of the first maps that we see that places the world into two hemispheres. You can see the two circular sides. Obviously, if we just have one hemisphere being shown here in this kind of circular format, we're not going to see every feature we want to see. We would have to stretch it out somehow. So kind of a way to compromise that. Yeah. Good question. Blau? Okay, Naomi's the expert on this stuff. I'll default to her. No? Blau? Okay. Thank you. Okay, next one. This is one that I haven't used in class. I was kind of searching for something, we have these maps from the 1600s. Was there anything that we had, 1700s, 1800s that we would think of as somewhat more recent? So I found this one, Colton's Map of the World. It was on Mercator's projection, so it looks fairly similar to the Mercator map. But this came out in 1852. It was centered on America, which is somewhat unique. You can see North America there at the center, rather than most world maps we see centered on the prime meridian. Here we have North and South America as the center, and it depicts the whole known world at the time. So fairly complete, still very decorative. If you look around the outside, the cartouches, really, really beautifully done. Added color that we don't see in a lot of the early maps. As color became easier to apply to maps, we start to see that show up more around this time period. All right, so questions on any of those, or do you want to go back and talk on any of those? Yeah. I think that was kind of the Christian viewpoint at the time. It wasn't? Okay. Okay. I don't know if they did at that point. They might have. What we know now, right? Yeah. They may have. I don't know enough about the history of how they understood magnetism and such at the time, if they had a good idea. I know Aristophanes was able to determine that we had a spherical Earth, not a flat Earth, way before a lot of these maps were even made. So that could have played into that happening. Yeah. Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't believe so. Doesn't mean they weren't, but not that I'm aware of. We wanted to know what the earth was like, right? What had we explored? What had we conquered? What could we see? How do we understand our world? Even now, we're still, sending expeditions to places, trying to learn things about our world. So kind of the same thing going on then, just obviously at a different sort of time period and magnitude. So other questions, thoughts? Okay, thank you. Okay. So we're going to go over some of the modern techniques, things that I'm teaching my students in class. And these are some of the ways that I also have students critique maps in class. And when we get to kind of that critiquing part, hopefully you'll remember a few of these things to kind of pick apart the maps accordingly. So first we'll define what a map is. So my favorite and I think best definition is a graphic representation that shows spatial relationships. I'm a geographer at heart. Where are things in space and how are they related to each other? So this definition really resonates with me of what I think of as a map and how I think about using maps. So we have a very simplistic thematic map on the left there that's showing the suburb population that's age 65 plus in, I believe that's Victoria Island, looks right. And it's just showing where we have darker blues, there is more elderly population. Where there's lighter blues, we have a younger population. So pretty basic thematic map. On the right, we have something just a little more fun. We don't have things divided by any particular unit. It's kind of spread across the surface, and it is the generic term used for sweetened carbonated beverages. Do you say soda, pop, or Coke? So depending on where you came from, you might say it a little bit different than other locations. So they don't have to be as rigorous or scientific as the one on the left. They can also just be for fun. One I usually like to show my students in the fall semester is a story map that goes through where your products for your Thanksgiving dinner are coming from. Where do cranberries come from? Where do most of the turkeys come from? So it can be just for fun too. So going through things that make a map a map. We have the definition showing spatial relationships, but first it's typically going to be some sort of vertical or oblique view. So we have a view of Crater Lake here. On the left, it's kind of a combination of an aerial and topographic map. And on the right-hand side, we have just an oblique sort of aerial view of Crater Lake area. I think there's text that should show up. Yeah, maps are generally vertical or oblique views. I hope the other ones, okay, you might need to click twice. Oh, no. Okay, never mind, sorry. Map scale. So they have to utilize a scale, right? We can't represent things in a 1-to-1 ratio. If we did, the map would have to be as big as the world. Kind of defeats the purpose of having a map. So we have to adjust to the scale. And depending on what sort of information we want to show will help us decide what scale we need to use. Are we using something that's considered a small scale, showing the entire United States or the entire world? Are we using something that's large scale, really focused on an area? So this kind of goes at the top from our more small scale maps to a larger scale map. And you can see it going from the entire United States and getting closer and closer to the city of Atlanta, getting to a larger and larger scale. So larger scale, we can also show a lot more detail. The small scale, we couldn't fit the amount of detail that's shown on that large scale map into it. We just don't have the space. That's one of the trade-offs that we as cartographers have to make, is deciding if we're set at a particular scale, what information can we show? We can't show it all, right? We have to decide specifically what's there. So going from small to large scale, that also dictates some of the other things that we'll kind of talk about later in the presentation. Thanks. We use projections. Like I talked about with Mercator's projections, we have to take this globe, this round feature that we have, and make it flat, whether it's for viewing on your computer screen or viewing on a piece of paper. Naomi brought some lovely maps we can look at. But we have to figure out a way to take this round feature and make it flat. Have you ever tried to cut an orange or take the peel off an orange and lay it flat? You can't, right? Without cutting, tearing, stretching something. You have to modify it somehow. So with all of these projections, there's some sort of trade-off. And it typically has to do with shape, area, distance, or direction. So some sort of distortion is happening. So if you look at Mercator's projection, one of the big issues that is considered why it's a problem, at least, to use the Mercator map, is that areas, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, tend to be exaggerated in size. So it keeps the lovely shape of features. So the features are looking like things that we would recognize on a globe, but we don't necessarily see them in the correct proportion for size. So all of these maps have some sort of trade-off in that shape, area, distance, or direction based on how it's projected. Maps have generalization, right? This is similar to scale in that, we can't provide all of the detail, all of the information on that piece of paper. We have to generalize the information. So we refer to generalization, kind of the definition here: selection, simplification, and symbolization of that detail. And we like to look at it relative to the purpose and scale of the map, right? I mentioned scale. That's really important in dictating what we can put on there, but also the purpose of the map. And I always tell my students, I will be a broken record at the beginning of the semester. It's all about purpose and audience. Who is using it and how are they using it? Without knowing that, it can be difficult to make a map that's going to meet those needs. So it's really important, if you can, you don't always know your audience, but you definitely have to know the purpose to be effective. But generalization, we have to do some sort of generalization to get the information on the map. On the left-hand side, we have a general zoning map of the state of Oregon. We can see if it's agriculture, forestry, urban, or something else. Very simplistic. Just shows a few different categories. It's not getting into the very details of zoning. If we were talking about that, we would have urban broken down into different types of residential, industrial, and we don't have those here. We have it very generalized. You can see where the larger cities are, Portland kind of up in the top, and get an idea of where more of the forests are, but we're not going to get specifics. We're not going to use this for planning a town. The map on the right is just a little cut from a USGS topographic map. Obviously, we've zoomed in here, right? We're at a larger scale, so we can provide more detail. But still, we don't see everything, right? We just can't. We can't fit it on the page because of that scale difference. So we have to generalize the information. We have to have symbols. You're used to seeing symbols, right? If you read any sort of map, atlas or otherwise, you're going to have some sort of symbol on there. Maybe it's an H for the hospital or a plane for the airport. But it's up to the cartographer to choose those symbols. What represents what on that map? Hopefully it relates fairly well and we can pick up on them easily, but not necessarily. We might have something a little more creative or a little different that's represented based on the symbolization that they choose. The map on the right, a very simple map. The circles don't necessarily represent anything that we recognize, but they're trying to show us levels of magnitude. This is a graduated symbol map, so the larger circles mean more, smaller circles mean less. Pretty intuitive, right? I didn't even have to tell you that. You don't even have to read the numbers to know that those larger circles mean more. So that's one of the things that cartographers try to use, is these things that automatically make sense to us. How do we represent where we have higher motor vehicle deaths? Where do we have lower? And we can do that very, very easily with the use of these symbols. Okay, questions on that part of those components of mapping? Okay, so you all know what a map is, right? We've gone through some technical things. You knew what a map is before you came here. But we'll talk about some of the techniques. Visual hierarchy and visual variables. Symbols we mentioned briefly already, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Color, classification, which is thinking about grouping, and then labeling, which is always a fun one. All right, so visual hierarchy, that's how we manipulate the information on the map to make features stand out, is really the basic way. But talking about visual strength. So we've got the same area mapped here. This is the Oakland area. So on the left-hand side, we can see where we have bigger streets, smaller streets, water features. we can pick them out, right? We have an idea. But if we adjust that visual hierarchy just a little bit, we didn't make too many changes, but we made the highways orange, some of the larger streets yellow. All of a sudden, the information pops off the page a little bit better, right? So the cartographer here has employed using visual hierarchy. The streets aren't any wider or smaller. They've just changed the hierarchy to really have the information jump out that they think is important. So applying that visual strength of the components. So when we think about visual variables, we talk about shape, orientation, color, texture, value, and size, and value not as in numerical value. The first two sets, the shape, orientation, color, and texture, we look at qualitative data, non-numerical data. The last two are quantitative data, numerical information. Shape, that's thinking about circles, triangles, squares. Orientation is directionality. The favorite one I like to use is a dead or live tree that I have on one of my slides for my students. The live tree is standing up. We have the same image rotated to show a dead tree. Pretty simplistic, but it gets the point across using that orientation as a way to do so. You have color, which is differences in hues, red, green, blue. Texture, that can vary. It can be dots, it can be hashing, whatever it might be that fits the purpose of the map. Value is thinking about the relative strength of the color. So you can see there you have light blue, then a medium blue, and a dark blue. So we automatically assign that light blue being a lower value numerically, because we're now talking about quantitative data. And the darker color is going to mean more of something, right? I didn't have to tell you that. You probably already made that assumption. So it's a very strong visual variable. It's very quick and easy for us to pick up on. Same thing with size. Smaller is less value, larger, higher value. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about points or lines, the same things apply there. We don't have something that really works for size with areas unless we're talking about some things like cartograms, and we have an example later in the presentation. Okay. So how many groups do we have here? This isn't a trick, I promise. 2, right? It probably took you a second. You needed to scan the image and make sure you weren't missing anything, right? So you have circles and triangles. All right, next one. Okay, was it quicker now? We added the visual variable of value. So this kind of light gray and dark gray. And we didn't change anything else, but just that addition makes it pop off the page a little more. It's quicker and easier. And we're talking milliseconds here, but it does make it easier for that reader to digest the information and get it much quicker. All right, so here's an example. This is largest foreign-born group in each county. And then we have Canada, Western Europe, Asia, Latin America, Russia, and East Europe, and Africa. They're all using different hues, different colors, right? The strength of the colors are fairly similar, which is important because we don't want to show variations of different colors. That goes back to using those differences in value. We would be indicating something different. So they've used kind of the same strength of colors and just different hues of them. But then they've also included these bubbles or proportional symbols to show where we have more and less of a particular population. And you can kind of already see a pattern, right? Where we have more foreign-born groups residing and where you have less. And you can quickly pick up their potential country of origin based on this map. Any thoughts or comments on this one? I think this was actually pretty well done. This isn't one of the bad ones. Well, it's based on just foreign population. So I don't know if North Dakota would have more foreign population because it's not looking at just total population. It's looking at foreign. Yes, sorry. Oh, yes. Okay, yes, the question was about South Dakota versus North Dakota, just overall population. And I pointed out that for this, it's not looking at overall population, but that specifically that's foreign born. So my assumption is based on this map that North Dakota has more foreign born population. And it looks like I can't really tell the color from here if it's blue or purple. So it's either Russian, East Europe, or Western Europe. So again, implementing both the symbols and our colors here to show two different things. This is also considered a multivariate or bivariate map. So it's showing two different aspects of the population, right? How much of it and what country it's from. So two different things. So we call that bivariate or multivariate, showing two or more variables. Symbols. We talked about these earlier. We think of these as, things we put on atlases, but we have a lot of different ways we can use symbols. I like the little cows there. I think they're cute. They don't distract from the purpose. It's, it kind of goes along with a theme. It's looking at cattle and calves sold in 1997. So again, it's using size. And then it just makes it kind of fun by having them sort of shaped like cows. But notice they're fairly simplistic representation of the cattle. The problem we have with using some of these sort of mimetic or pictogram type images is that these symbols can all of a sudden look very busy. I use an example in my class that has something that looks like a car, but it has the windows cut out and different, I think it's got cutouts for the wheels as well. All of a sudden it gets really complicated and you lose kind of the purpose trying to figure out where the cars are and how many cars there are. So if we are going to use something that is mimetic or pictographic, we want to make sure that it's fairly simplistic. The map on the right-hand side is a traditional dot map. So each dot represents some sort of quantity. Here it is 1 dot equals 1,000 people. So we're looking at the population in Australia. Dot maps are specific for showing density, not necessarily quantity. You're not going to count all those dots, right? I would pull my hair out if I tried to count all of those dots. But it's showing us generally where we have denser population and where we have, more sparse population. So a dot map is a way we can use symbols to show density of some sort of phenomenon. Thanks. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes, do you want to go back to that one if we can real quick? Yes, so about color blindness, great point. Thank you very much for whoever brought that up. Reds, greens, blues, oof. If you have color blindness, and there's about 4% of the population that is colorblind, they would have a difficult time reading this map because of that. So we often advise students away from using any sort of red-green combination since that's the most common. But they could try to employ some other sort of color scheme that didn't utilize those, or potentially a different visual variable if they needed to. Great point. Thank you. All right, then you can go to the next one. All right. Points, lines, and areas, how we represent these things. Atlas makers, I know there was a gentleman from the group that emailed me and said he used to make some of the atlases, and I'm glad that's not me. I wouldn't have the patience to figure all of this out, the different line types, the different symbols, how they put all the text and labels on there. Just baffles my mind that they can put so much information on there. However, there's always trade-offs. They have to decide what goes where and what to include and what to exclude. Think back to our scale and generalization. The cartographer is making decisions here. What needs to be represented, what's important for this map, and what can be left off because it doesn't all fit. Color. So getting a little more specific into that one, hopefully this one isn't as bad for colorblind. The blue to red tends to work a little bit better than say red to green. But color can just simply be clarifying. It makes it easier to read the information and simply, put it on the page without really having to read it, right? We can see and automatically assume where there's darker colors, it means something bad probably, and lighter colors mean something maybe not so bad. And here we're looking at average temperatures in August of 2018. So thinking along the lines of climate change. Darker red meaning the record warmest temperatures, And getting into the blues, which we don't have all of the blues on there, but getting into some of the blue colors, we know that we have some below average temperatures. So that would actually be, while we're talking about the colors, one of my critiques of this map is that they have two colors being represented here that are not on the map. That is always a bad thing to do, because I'm looking at the map going, where is that dark blue? Am I missing something? It's possible this was a comparison between different time periods where they needed to include that same color scale, but that's something to look out for when you're critiquing these maps, is to see, are all the colors and information that's in that legend actually being represented on the page? Color just generally increases that perceptibility, and also attracts attention. We like looking at color much better than we do grayscale. This is just a comparison of two different maps. This was a funny site that I found. It's called mominitaly.com, and she posted two different maps, one in kind of black and white or grayscale and one in color. Very quickly, you're probably drawn to the color one, right? You're seeing things better. You can quickly see the difference in countries. You don't have to look so hard to find that information. So similar to that visual variable of the shapes and then adding that value, same thing here. When we add that color very quickly, it's clarifying the information and not taking us as much time to digest that map information. So when we talk about color, we also have to talk about color schemes. So we have three different color schemes that we rely on. The first being qualitative. This is what the foreign-born map was using. So just differences in color. They are similar in value, as in kind of that relative strength. We don't have pastels mixed with very bold colors. They're all about that same sort of level. But it's not indicating any sort of order. It's just difference in kind. Apples, oranges, Europe, Africa, Asia, just different. In the middle, we have sequential. This is where we have one hue or a hue transition of some sort. I don't think we have, the bottom one is our closest to a hue transition, going from kind of a yellow to orange to kind of burnt brownish color. But it's showing a sequence of values. We're going in one direction there. 0 to 100, 101 to 200, very specific to quantitative information, numerical information. And the last one is probably the most confusing, I think, for everyone. And this was on that average temperature map, is a diverging color scheme. So you're using two different hues or hue transitions. So two sort of sequences. And the thing with the diverging color scheme is there needs to be some sort of middle point or value. It can be a 0, and you can have positive and negative numbers from the middle and then going either direction, or it can be something like an average literacy rate by county. And then you can have that average as the demarcation to see where you have above average literacy and below average literacy within particular counties. So it's a little more to kind of think about and process, and a little, I think, harder for students to initially apply, but really, really powerful in kind of showing variations and differences. So qualitative, sequential, and diverging are the three color schemes that we rely on. So I found this one online. I thought was pretty well done. Sequential with a hue transition. So we've got that really dark, kind of almost black color at the bottom, and it goes to a really light color, and this is showing population density. So it's almost somewhat reverse of what we think, of darker meaning more, lighter meaning less, but I think it's very well done. I think we can still get the information from this, but I'd love some thoughts and opinions. This is the first time I've kind of showed this map to anyone. Does it work well? Does it give you an idea of where the population is? The darker is less, right? Which is reverse. Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, right? Where there's light would be, right, where there's people, right? So maybe some differing thoughts on that. But I think it's very beautifully done, and they have used a sequential color scheme, even if they've kind of reversed that color scheme of what we traditionally think of. This is a diverging color scheme gone wrong. Not only are we going to have issues with color blindness here with our reds and greens, we also have just a sequential progression of values. We're going from less than 30, 30 to 40, and so on up to 81 to 100. And this is supposed to represent road deaths per million inhabitants. It's all over the place. I can't kind of pick what's going on here. Obviously, red is the worst. I'm seeing that. I think the thought behind this, and I've used a similar map in my classes, is that the green means, okay, it's safer. The red means it's not as safe because the motor vehicle deaths are higher. However, it is using a diverging color scheme, which it should not be based on the data. It should be using something that's sequential. Or at least if they are going to use diverging, they should make an indication in that center portion of maybe what's the average. They could apply the average to that legend, and then we could get a better idea and better application for the diverging color scheme. So classification. This is how we divide things up. Breaking up is hard to do. How do we break the data up? Luckily, our computer software has lovely algorithms that they get to do that for us. We just say how many classes we want, and what scheme we want to use. However, we have to understand what those schemes are doing and how many classes is appropriate for representing the information. So in classification, we're trying to assign those individual values to some sort of group. But how many groups? Which scheme? And if you introduce a particular scheme in a number of classes, how does that introduce some sort of error? And there's multiple ways we can look at that error, but we won't dive into that. That gets kind of really technical and kind of processing through the mapped software. But here's a map showing a variety of classification schemes. We've got natural breaks, which uses some statistical algorithms to make sure that the features that are within each class are fairly similar to each other, and those that are in a different class should be more different than each other. I know that's kind of an odd way to think about it, but things that are together or are like will be together. Things that are different should be split apart into a different class. So the software does the algorithm and process it. We could do the processing by hand, but why not? Let's let the computer do it for us. Standard deviation, that's another statistical processing, but here notice they're using diverging color scheme. So they're looking at kind of deviations from the mean, how high above the mean or how far below the mean. If you think of your standard bell curve, which side of the bell curve does it fall on is really what that standard deviation is applying. Quantile, that's trying to group by equal numbers. So each of the colors has the same number of entities within it. If we have 25 entities, we'll say counties here. I think these are census tracts, probably census tracts. So we have 25 census tracts. We have 5 classes here. We're going to have 5 census tracts in each class. So it divides it up kind of equally. Another way to say that is equal frequency. The frequency is the same within each class. And then equal interval, that's the division of the values, should be the same for all of those. Sometimes you have things a little off at the beginning or the end based on how the data is, but they should be the same sort of interval. So it looks like it's about 5.2 or so difference between the values there. So you have that equal interval. The interval is going to be the same numerically in all of those classes. Questions? Okay. Oh, Naomi? Ooh, great question. Yeah, so which map represents the data best? What we say is to model the data, put it into the different classification schemes and see what pattern holds true. So for this one, I'm seeing a fairly similar pattern between natural breaks and quantile. Natural breaks is the default typically in most software programs because of how it represents the data, trying to group like things together and different things in separate classes. So these are pretty close, the quantile and equal interval, but I would say go with the natural breaks for this one, particularly for population as well. Another one here, we've got a lot of mortality. Sorry, guys, I shouldn't be having so much about traffic deaths and all of this sort of stuff, but these are a lot of our thematic maps. If we think about things related to health, and we see a lot of maps done fairly well. So this is just another example with the classification scheme. So focus less on the content and more on how they are classifying the data. So we have the first one with that equal frequency or quantile, same number of features within each class. The middle one is our equal interval, so that numerical spacing is the same. And the last one is Jinx, which is the natural breaks. It was created by a gentleman named Jinx, so sometimes it is referred to interchangeably as Jinx or natural breaks. So you can see, again, we've got a difference in representation. That middle map with the equal interval makes it look like there's not that much. It's not that bad, right? But the one to the left and the one to the far right show a more similar pattern. We can see that there is actually higher rates in areas being represented more consistently. That middle one kind of probably not representing that pattern very well. So this is what we talk about, how we choose them. There's no magic method for doing so. It's put the information into different classification schemes and see what pattern it shows us. So in this one, we're either going to go with the quantile or the Jinx representation or natural breaks representation. So either left-hand side or right-hand side. This is one from, I'm not sure who sent it. I can't remember the, okay. Okay, thank you. So from one of the members provided a copy of this map, which using a color scheme, if we're talking about color schemes, I would pick apart a few things on this one. So first, the classes overlap, 2 to 5 and 5 to 10, 10 to 20. So where does 10 fall? Does it fall in the 5 to 10 or the 10 to 20? So we've got some issues there with that. The other issue I have is that the colors are fairly similar. It looks a little better on my computer screen, and maybe it's just partly the scan, but going from the less than 2 all the way to about 20 to 30, I'm not going to see a difference on that map where those values are. So if I'm actually trying to figure out where 5 to 10% is, not only do I have that overlap issue of the numerical values, I also have color overlap. So I'm going to have a hard time picking that information out. We would also say that they have used too many classes. We say 5 to 7 is the magic number. If you're using a diverging color scheme where you have the 2 kind of hue transitions or hue progressions, you can get away with a little bit more, but we still say 5 to 7. Once we get much beyond that 7, we're going to have a hard time visually deciphering the difference. And you definitely see that here. We can only create so much different in contrast between the individual classes that it makes it hard to pull those values out of them. So pretty, I think, interesting and nice to look at, but if you really pick apart the data and how it's been done, I would have a hard time kind of digesting the information associated with it. All right, I think this is our last kind of technical topic, typography, or how we put labels on maps. We have some primary functions, obviously, to label things, know where things are, to explain information. We also use it to establish hierarchy or show size. If you've looked at any atlas map, a city like Denver is going to have larger text than Boulder or Erie or Centennial. We're showing that visual hierarchy, the size of that city, just in the labeling. We don't even have to look at the symbol associated with it. We can see it in the label alone. We also can use it to just direct or point attention. Where do I want the map reader to look? And I can use text to do so. I thought this was a really interesting map. I believe it's from, is it England? I think that looks about right based on some of the names, where they've just used the names and the size of the names. So we don't even have any actual map features. They're only using the labels and what's indicated in white there as the river to kind of give an idea of where things are relative in space. All right, so we've got a map here of the Great Lakes area. Lakes are labeled. We've got states, some of the major cities. We can get the information, right? Looks okay. I can tell where Michigan is. I generally know my geography of the US. Not great, but right, you can see it. Well, let's see the next image. So they've done some changes here with the text, that labeling, to all of a sudden give us an idea of visual hierarchy and differentiation of features. They've changed the water features to blue and italics, which is the standard that we kind of expect for kind of reference or atlas type maps. They've capitalized the countries to show hierarchy. You then see the either provinces or states also capitalized, but slightly smaller text and in a different color as well. It's kind of a light brown instead of a black like the countries are. And then you go down from there to the cities. We now have our mixed text, just capital on the beginning to represent the cities. So we very quickly made just a few minor changes and made the map much more readable. And we're quickly showing hierarchy without having to do anything else to our map. Look better, a little easier to read. Seeing a couple nods. Okay. So when we're talking about label placement, I could spend two 75-minute class periods going over label placement because it is so tedious and there are so many things about label placement that make it difficult. So the image in the upper right is showing kind of the software, how it automatically places labels, but this is also done through research of where is the best place to put a label for a point. So we've got a point in the center, say representing a city. The software will automatically try to put the label in point or position 1. It'll then go to 2, 3, and so on until it finds a place that it fits without interfering with other features. So we kind of use this as a guide to say, okay, if I'm manually placing labels, the first place I'm going to try is to the upper right, then to the upper left, and continue on from there. But notice none of them are horizontal. They're not directly in line with the point. They're all offset up or down, above or below, never perfectly in line with the point. We want to maintain a consistent distance between the point and the labels. So we shouldn't have big spaces between points and labels and really small spaces. They should be fairly consistent. Minimize the frequency of line breaks. So our example there of Julian, we place the label on top of the roads. It's put it in that number 1 best spot, right? So why is this a problem? Well, the roads below it, we're putting the label over that when we don't have to. We could go to position 4 and avoid the roads. So just a simple movement of that label, and all of a sudden we've avoided the roads and any need to do anything else to that label or the roads to make it clearer. Finally, position labels on the same side of the feature, except for coastal. So the examples down at the bottom, we've got poor on the right and good on the left. And poor being that we have this stream that's being labeled and we've got some cities that are adjacent to it, but we've got the label on one side of the river and the point on the other side of the river. We want to have those on the same side. So that good example on the left is just moved those labels so that the point and the label are together rather than separated by some other feature. Coastal features are a little bit different. I think I have a slide next that has coastal features. Yeah. So coastal features, we actually want to put coastal features on the coast to indicate that they are coastal features. So we've got an example here from the Oregon coast, Cannon Beach and Neskowin, Pleasant Valley, and the Pacific Ocean. So a couple things that they've adjusted here. They've moved Neskowin and Cannon Beach, which are coastal cities. They've moved that text out into the water. They have Pleasant Valley in the poor, kind of navigating between both the water and the land. If it's a land feature, we want to put all that text on the land, even if that means stacking the text like they've done in the good example. And then the Pacific Ocean, rather than having it fairly close leading, so kind of tight together in the text, They spread it out. And this is something we used both character spacing and leading. So that difference between the lines, kind of think of single space, double space if you're typing a letter. Same sort of thing applying there, but we're using that to show extent of features. The Pacific Ocean is large, it's not small. Let's extend that out. So not only does the size of the text represent the size of what we're trying to label here, but that extending of the text gives us that same sort of assumption or view of that feature. The other thing is about repeating and positioning along long features. So we've got a poor and good example labeling a river here. Well, actually two rivers. In the good example, we see that Gull River is labeled twice. You know, on this map, we probably don't need to do that, but say if we had a larger portion of the map and we want to spread that text out, right? To show that, okay, this is the Gull River over here, and it's also the Gull River over here. We don't want to stretch the label out like we do for Pacific Ocean. We want to label it multiple times. We do that for linear features. We also want to make sure we're consistent in the placing of that, of putting it above the feature. We don't always have the option to. We might have to place it below the feature. It's kind of like that optimal placing of position 1 and 2 and so on. We want to put it on top, like the good example there, rather than below in our poor example. And last thing, we want to see the labels at a fairly straight portion of a river, if we have that option, and fairly horizontal. We don't want the labels going in different directions where someone would have to turn the map 2 different ways. You know, you've got one text running from bottom to top, the other running from top to bottom. All of a sudden, you know, you're playing this game of Twister with your map. You don't want to do that. We want to have them facing in the same direction to make it easier to read. Okay, I think that was, yes, question? Okay. Yeah, so the question was about kind of English and North American reading of top to bottom versus other countries where they don't have that tradition. And I don't know enough about foreign mapping if they follow these same sort of procedures or not. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with the map collections you have. Okay, I apologize. We don't have an answer for that question, but a great one. Thank you. All right. Any questions on that stuff before we really get into talking about the maps that I pulled together? Okay, so maps galore. So this is from one of the members as well. So Wales and West Midlands, a mobile road map. I forget what year this was, but a road map for traveling the area, right? I think if you hit again, have kind of a zoom in. So that was a couple images from the roadmap. And I zoomed in so you could see how they labeled features, what they look like on the map. So it is black and white, and very starkly black and white. Lots of cities and highways labeled, but not much else, right? Very simplistic, very focused on traveling via car from one location to another. But what are your thoughts on this one? It's simple, easy to read. I'm not sure about the contrast with the black background and the white text. It's not bad, but I think they could maybe use something a little different for that coloration. But overall, fairly well done. We've got coastal labels out in the coast, you know, so they've used some of those standard sort of label placement guidance that we have. Yeah. Red light readable. Okay. That would be why it is in the color format it is. Great. Okay. So context matters, right? All right. Next. This is actually from a student map competition that GIS Colorado just put on. And I thought this was great, really, really well done. Of course, I was able to pick apart some things on it. I can always find a few little things I would change there. But this is the race to the clouds. So the drive up to Pikes Peak when they do I think it's the car races, right? Is the race to the clouds. And I was extremely impressed with how well they labeled the features, how well they applied visual hierarchy with their labels, all the little details that they put, showing spectator areas, hot corners in red, lots of information. They've got a really big north arrow, which I don't know if is necessarily needed. What I teach my students is if the map is oriented north, there's no reason to put a north arrow on there. And the scale bar is pretty big, kind of takes up the whole bottom page. We could make that a little bit smaller. I don't think we need to quite measure that. But any thoughts from the group? Do you like the contours in the background? Do you like the colors? There's a lot going on here. I was thinking that too, but I was going with. Seems like different direction. Okay. Okay, so that's how the road goes. That's how the road goes. It goes from north to south. Top going to the bottom. But if you're at the top. No. The road runs from the south to the north. So that road is on. That start is on the road just outside of Manitou Springs, which is north of. Okay, so you're saying it's correct. It's correct. Okay. Yeah. What about anything else? Contours, colors? Contours help a lot, particularly in something. Right, a big change in elevation, and it's nice to see that information represented here. So you get some context of what that elevation change is, that it's not just drive along a curvy road, that they're actually making this big feat, from bottom to top. Okay. Okay, so like having a profile would be more helpful. So seeing not necessarily the contours, which are a little more abstract, I think, for most map readers, where if you have a profile, I know I was talking to a running friend, she's like, this doesn't mean anything to me. I need to look at the profile. I need to see that horizontal view rather than looking at it as if I were flying over like a bird. I want to see what it's actually going on with how high and low that's going along the path. So great comment. Okay, we'll go to the next one. This one I found online, which I thought was really, really pretty. For lack of a better word, I like things that look nice, right? So this is from 1894. And you can see lots of beautiful detail here. This one's much more artistic than our last one, right? The other one was very practical, very focused on, figuring out where to spectate, how high they're climbing, where the big corners are. This one is really about showing the area, and I don't read the language that it's in, so I can't tell you what they say. But they've got fairly well done labeling. They've done the character spacing where they've spread out the labels for wide ranging features such as things like the Rocky Mountains. You would spread out the text. They've got coastal features labeled out in the coast. They've got lots of little detail, and you can't probably see it maybe on Zoom. But the coloration kind of showing hill shade. So instead of using something like contour lines, they're using this difference in coloration over this map surface to give us an idea of what the depth or elevation change is from the coastal areas up to kind of our peak area in the center there. Any comments on this one? Oh, okay. Let's move through a couple more then. We'll skip this one, skip that one. Okay, this one we actually have here. Naomi brought this one in a book for you to look at over on the tables there. So this is what we call a cartogram. So it is representing the states or sizing the states differently, using our visual variables of size to show some sort of quantity. They're using these hexagonal features to show the counties, that size, that cartogram, and it's a non-contiguous cartogram. They didn't keep the states adjacent to each other and kind of distort the shape of the feature. They kept those shapes and just changed the size. And this is looking at broiler chicken sales. Very obscure representation here. Not something I would have thought to map, but you look at it and it looks fairly well done. They've used size for the symbols of the little chickens. They've used our mimetic symbols for those, but then they've also done differences in coloration and provided those proportional symbols by those hexagonal features in the legend. Any thoughts on this one? Yes, they do sell a lot of chickens in Georgia. I was surprised by that too. And they even obviously focused on the state of Georgia. Yeah, pretty small. They keep it pretty low. No concentration of chickens being sold there. I don't know if that has to do with fried chicken in the South or if there's some other explanation for that. I think this is by actual sales in stores, so where they would be buying them. So it's not saying that Colorado doesn't have any, but it doesn't have the broiler chickens. Yes, maybe we buy different types of chicken or pieces of chicken instead of the broiler chicken. I don't know. It says sales in 2012. So I thought pretty interesting representation. And the cartograms sometimes are well received, sometimes not. More often they are better received when we can recognize the shape of the features. If we have cartograms that are contiguous, then we start to distort the shape and you can't recognize, okay, what does Georgia look like? What does Florida look like? They're distorted in shape. So the non-contiguous tend to sit better with general map audience. Okay, let's see what else we have. Let's keep going. We'll skip a few of these. Keep going. A couple more. I put a lot in here. I didn't know how many we were going to talk about. Okay, I would like to mention this one because it's a very different technique, is using those hasher lines to show the changes in elevation. So another way to represent those features. We have things like hillshades, contour lines, and here we have these small lines. They were typically done in the 1800s. And this is for the largest glacier in the Alps and showing the changes in elevation there. So I thought very beautifully done. These require so much detail. This isn't being made by a computer, very hand detailed oriented and showing those changes in elevation. Lots of good labeling as well. So really beautiful map to me. Okay, let's see. This one's fun. I thought this one, Ice Cream Island. So imaginary place, messy meridian, sloppery slopes. So maps don't have to be about actual data or places. They can just represent fun things. So I really liked this one. This was from 2013, Ice Cream Island, As the Crow Flies. They even have a little cherry on the top of the north or the compass rose. Okay, let's see. I think I'm about out of time. I do want to mention this one briefly. States with lakes deeper than Crater Lake. Anybody see anything missing there? This is a lack of mapping. In other words, there are no states that have lakes deeper than Crater Lake. So kind of an interesting take on mapping lakes. Okay. I will, let's see. I'll mention, actually no, because I want to talk about the ones that Naomi brought on the table. So we'll skip over some of these. This one we have on the table over there. I have a description associated with it, but I think it's in my notes on on the actual presentation. So I don't have the description in front of me. I don't know if you can access the notes at all. Probably not. Okay, then don't worry about it. So a world map, we have North America and South America as our central view. So kind of using that different perspective again here. Beautiful coloration, some terrain being indicated here by the undulations of both the ocean and the land, which is fairly different. Can you click another one though? Okay, this is the one I use in my class to talk to students about labeling. Can you figure out where anything is? Whew. So you know, at first glance, it's a very beautiful map, but you kind of dive into how they're representing this information. And they have decided not to use enough generalization whatsoever. They've also used, I think, probably about 10 different types of text, not consistent in their text size and what they're labeling with which particular types of text. It just gives me a headache to even look at it. But, you know, you look far away, it looks really pretty, but you kind of zoom in and you see, whoa, there's a lot going on here. And the description was fairly entertaining of how wonderful they thought this map was. Did you find it, Naomi? Sure, I can read it real quick. Okay. So, Atlantic-centered world Monticolor wall map is a general reference physical world map. The map is beautifully drawn and is a very colorful rendition of the world. It is not a typical physical world map. Crisp mountain features and river systems complement the use of color in this map, which also shows ocean trenches and ridges. So very vivid description. They are trying to sell their map here for sure, but you're not going to use it to really learn any sort of geography. I think it's going to be pretty hard to pick that one up. And then I think I have one more that I want to talk about. Okay, so the RMMS maps, Essential Geography of the United States. And I wasn't familiar with this one before Naomi told me, like, hey, do you want to include this one? And I'm like, okay, well, what's so special about it, right? It's just an atlas. It looks like any other atlas. However, this gentleman worked 7 days a week for 2 full years, hand placing all of the detail on this map. So not using any automatic computer system, you know, that thing where I said, okay, placement 1, placement 2, he was doing this all by hand. So nothing left to any sort of computer defaults, tweak those labels manually, slaving over fonts, kerning, which is the spacing between letters, and then letter thickness to represent all the features in the United States. So Naomi has that over on the table as well. So any last, are we to time, Naomi? I think we're a little past. Okay, so, okay, I guess open it up to any sort of last questions, but feel free to look at the maps and map books that Naomi brought, kind of showing some of these examples. But thank you again for having me, and thank you for participating as well.
You mentioned, you know, it depends on the audience and what you want to show. Truly objective map that you just put in there, there's no, probably just a satellite picture or something that Google Maps, but they still play with.
Yeah, a satellite is going to be the only thing that's even close to being objective. Yeah, we all have biases, whether we think so or not. I'm like, I like this particular font, or I like this particular color. Even if we are not really thinking about it in that way, we're going to apply some sort of bias to it. So an aerial photograph is about the only thing. And hopefully those aren't too modified where we're getting some bias there too. Exactly. No matter how much we try, it's always there. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'll stick around for a little bit. Feel free to ask me any questions.
I think this season, but this very instructive. I'm not going to look at a map again in the same way. Still looking at the fonts and the lines. Oh. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, everybody in the Zoom land. And I was just mentioning that we will not ever be able to see a map again and without looking at fonts and lines and things like this. So great seeing you. We'll see you probably in September when we resume. our fall session. Have a great summer, everybody.